I'd like to ask the Treasury Minister what data his department holds that there is sufficient flexible work available in the job market to accommodate those people affected by his proposed changes to employed persons allowance and income support.
Minister to reply.
Mr. President, at the end of December 2018, there were 340 full-time and 106 part-time vacancies registered with the Job Centre. At least half of these required no qualifications and a third required no experience. There will almost certainly be further opportunities for work not registered with the Job Centre via employers. At the same time, registered unemployment stood at 354, an unemployment rate of just 0.8%. Indeed, the island's unemployment rate has been at or below 1% for well over a year. Mr. President, I am aware that part-time vacancies exist across various sectors, including cleaning services, driving, healthcare, customer service, hospitality and catering, administration, retail, childcare and education. Employment advisors at the Job Centre are available and keen to provide personalised advice, support and assistance to all job seekers, including identifying the vacancies which may be appropriate to an individual's circumstances or desires.
Supplementary, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to ask the Treasury Minister how he manages to reconcile the view that Treasury clearly holds that there is sufficient flexible work out there for everyone who wants it, with responses to, for example, the Social Attitude Survey, which identified a significant number of people who were actively looking and willing to engage in more work were finding obstacles such as an unavailability of hours, feedback which has then been reinforced by the actual direct experience that his department has received from the job-focused interviews he's just told us about.
Minister.
Mr. President, I mean, the system works two ways. Admittedly, there are some who will say that the work is not out there, and there are others, including employers, who will tell us face-to-face that they have got additional hours for people who need it, and indeed have offered people those additional hours and that they have been declined. Now, I would suggest that from the state perspective, the distribution of welfare support, it's absolutely right, I think, that when, and this is the key issue in this particular case, I think, is that when a child, the youngest child reaches 13 years of age, we are talking about them going from 16 hours a week to 30 hours a week. The support mechanisms within the Social Security and Job Centre are that work-face conversations are available. Obviously, the relationship between the Job Centre and employers is absolutely vital. And as I said, we have significant numbers of vacancies registered at the Job Centre for both part-time and full-time work. Now, the onus, whilst there is onus on the Job Centre and Social Security, there is also onus on an individual to make every single effort that they can to get out and try and find the appropriate level of work, even if that means looking at different jobs. And what we are trying to do is to make sure that we're in a position to help people and to facilitate that as much as we possibly can. But there is also an onus on the individual concerned, as there is an onus on everybody in society, to take responsibility for their own careers and to get out and find work. I don't think that's unreasonable request. And certainly, I mean, the reasons why this Honourable Court has taken positive steps, I think, in terms of relaxing work permits, for example, is because the information that we have is that the job requirements, the pressures on hospitality and catering, for example, to find staff to come in and do flexible work, the demand is there, and given the unemployment levels, given the demand for staff, given the current success indicators from the economy, then I think there is enough evidence for us to reasonably expect that there is opportunities and that therefore the advisors in the Job Centre and the individuals should work closely together to try and resolve that. The other point I would raise, particularly when talking about this issue, a proposed issue, because nothing's actually been accepted yet, but you know the proposals were about 16 to 30 hours, is that you will have noted in the consultation that there was an initial thought that people should do 24 hours when their child reached 6 years old. And you will note that Social Security, Treasury rode back from that, given the sort of consultation responses, and accepted a lot of the feedback. But therefore, in saying that someone's going to have to move from 16 hours to 30 hours, you've effectively got 7 years to recognise that if you're going to claim EPA for that length of time, or you're going to claim income support, that when your child reaches 13 years of age, that we would reasonably expect you to do more for society in return for the support mechanism that you are receiving. So the onus is I think, on both parties, both on the Social Security and the Job Centre to do its job, help people, retrain people, talk to employers, but also on an individual must take some responsibility for ensuring that they are ready and prepared to increase their hours of work, or indeed to get back to work.
Honourable Member Mr Robert Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr President, I beg your pardon. I wonder whether the Treasury Minister can enlighten me at all. And in his pursuit, clear pursuit of trying to create a more flexible and responsive system around these various matters, is he able to indicate to me what it is that has us fixed at this 16-hour figure? It's his anchor point is 16 hours. What does it mean? Where did it come from? What's its value? And does he not consider that perhaps in his quite reasonable pursuit of flexibility that has value for both the employee and the employer, that this arbitrary 16-hour anchor is in fact an impediment? I'm personally at a loss to understand why this figure of 16 hours was arrived at in the first place. Where did it come from? What does it mean?
Minister to reply.
Well, I was hoping that the former Minister for Health and Social Security might be in a better position to answer that question, actually, given that he was there and part of this, the Employed Persons Allowance, 16 hours. Mr. President, I'm unable to give a specific reply into why 16 hours was initially identified by officers and by parliamentarians and accepted as a base. But whatever the historical connotations, what I would say is that it seems to me to be a reasonable balance for somebody whose child is over 6 years old and wants to claim Employed Persons Allowance to find at least just over 3 hours work a day if you took that through the working week, standard working week, Monday to Friday. It's not a lot to ask. I can certainly look back in terms of the history of this, but again, there is a chance for some honourable members to feed back in now, because we will be not intending to come back with these proposals until May. That for honourable members to feed in if they think now that the 16 hours per se should be adjusted upwards or downwards. And I will look back and try and respond to the honourable member in terms of when in history 16 hours was decided as an appropriate level for Employed Persons Allowance.
Honourable Member Mr Baker.
Thank you very much, Mr President. Treasury Minister is obviously aiming to strike a difficult balance in a full employment situation between individual responsibility and collective support. In doing that, will he recognise the particular challenges around school holidays, the additional challenges that those bring for parents? We've seen it with holiday hunger, where everybody carries on okay during the school term, but then the school holidays come along and create additional challenges and issues. Clearly that's going to be similar with where people are trying to balance work commitments and childcare, especially where families don't have extended support. So would the Treasury Minister consider this when reflecting what proposals to bring forward in May?
Minister to reply.
I think that in bringing forward proposals, I don't think it's possible to solve every single conundrum that the government or society is currently dealing with. Now, school holidays have been around for decades, and I mean only recently has the conversation around support in school holidays become to the fore, shall we say, although I'm sure it's been around in some form previously. I think the point is that not every situation can be catered for, and that we have to act in a manner that is fair and appropriate. Now, I think we have taken the view with these proposals that from 13, and I'm just going to focus on, because that's really predominantly where the impact I think that the Honourable Member is talking about comes in. It's that from the age of 13, that to a certain extent, children are capable of spending some short periods without adult supervision. Certainly in the case of my son, who's just turned 14, but for the last year, I know that he comes home from school by himself, is perfectly capable of letting himself in, perfectly capable of making a sandwich or raiding the biscuit tin or doing whatever they do at 13 years of age, and is able to support himself until a relevant parent can get back, given that both parents are working. And I know from his friends, many of whom I see on a regular basis, and their parents, that many parents are in a similar situation and have to work through the school holiday system as best they can. And of course many parents will seek, particularly if they're couples obviously, and lone parents will seek to take holidays during that appropriate time. Now, I appreciate for lone parents it does get a bit more complicated, but also one has to also recognise that we have this problem throughout society, not just for those on EPA, but for those on lower incomes who are not claiming benefits and yet whose tax money is in theory feeding into the system that is supporting individuals who are receiving welfare benefits. So I think there's got to be a fairness throughout society. I think the answer to his question is that it's a broader issue, Mr. President, one that is actually multidisciplinary in terms of going across departments, and I would look at both Social Security. I'd talk to Department for Department for Enterprise, possibly the Department of Health and Social Care. And so I would hope that more broadly that this issue can be looked at collectively across government, but I don't perceive this as an issue that should necessarily block this reform unless honourable members feel that they don't want to take these reforms forward in due course.
Honourable Member for Council, Mr Lord Brennan.
Thank you, Mr President. I'm not sure why, but we seem to be equating flexible work with lower paid work, and we seem to be talking about lone parents and the necessity to retrain. Would the Minister agree that flexible work need not necessarily be low paid, and actually encouraging flexibility of professional work and all types of work might be part of the answer? Thank you.
Minister.
Mr President, I certainly agree with the honourable member that yes, I mean we're tending to think that this is low paid work, and I suppose that in thinking that one would I guess perhaps unfairly categorise some of these individuals as unskilled workers, and you're quite right, not everybody is an unskilled worker and could quite easily potentially find skilled employment. What I would say, in slightly broadening out the answer to that question, is we have done the maths, and I will present this to honourable members, but people are going to be better off once their child reaches 13 getting into work, and even in the lowest case scenario, earning £8 an hour, just over the minimum wage. A lone parent even would be better off, we think, by about £54 a week, £2,827 per annum, and that's with everything currently taken versus where they would be if they took on the additional hours. So being in work provides a significant number of benefits, but this is really also not just about the financial side of life, but also about being fair and appropriate both to the welfare recipient and also to those, the taxpayer effectively, who is supporting that welfare recipient.
Supplementary, Mr Hooper.
Thank you, Mr President. I think what's coming through very clearly to me, and I hope the Treasury Minister would agree with this, is that there is an apparent mismatch between supply and demand in our labour market, and underemployment itself as an issue is not particularly well understood by government. We only have a very incomplete picture of the issue surrounding underemployment, and I think the Treasury Minister identifying this as a complex and wide-ranging issue is quite helpful. And I'd just ask him to consider, instead of bringing forward revised proposals in isolation, making changes simply to the benefit system, that maybe this should form part of a slightly larger piece of work involving other government departments and agencies to make sure that the real issues are addressed and that we can actually help people get back into work in a sustainable manner.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. President, I think we are helping people get back into work. All the figures are suggesting that we are helping people get back into work. Now, I think, you know, I understand, I hear what the Honourable Member is saying, but my experience of politics is if you try to solve all the world's issues, you will actually never, ever go anywhere, and at some point you have to start taking steps forward that are reasonable. I think part of this is not only an education process, obviously, and we need to ensure that when we're speaking with parents in these situations who are doing employed persons allowance, that we are preparing them well in advance for the fact that their hours are going to change. But we also need to be working with employers as well to understand their requirements and promoting additional and innovative ways of working. And job sharing is one example that I would certainly use in terms of the way that this could be applied. I think that you have to sometimes, Mr. President, act in a manner in which is reasonable and fair. Accept that, accepting in this case, if you accept that a child from 13 years of age means that they in theory require less parental direct support, and that working from 6 up until the age of 13, parents can do literally 16 hours a week in order to get additional benefits into their family, and of course those benefits reflecting in society. But I think that what we need to do is ensure that we are doing everything possible and that is reasonable to find the solutions. And if in due course it emerges that in fact the situation has changed and there isn't the flexibility in requirements in the employment sector, in the economy, then we also need to do other measures. So we may need, for example, to tighten up on work permits if we find that the availability of jobs for our own people, which we're being told at the moment is at very high levels, is not actually there. So I think at certain points you have to take steps forward. And I also perhaps would like to say that sometimes with these measures, and in politics, it's a bit like physics. With every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction somewhere, and sometimes you have to pick up that reaction and then deal with that as you progress.
Honourable Member Mr. Baker.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think the Treasury Minister has hit on a really important point from this series of questions, that actually there is a broader issue at work here. Mm-hmm. And he's touched on it, and what he described as the balance between work and family commitments. And he indicated that it needs a multidisciplinary approach across departments, and that's where government often struggles. So when he indicated that he would hope that this would be more collectively looked at, we're clearly hoping isn't a strategy. So will he undertake to pick this up with his council ministers' colleagues and actually have a conversation about how we can actually move forward in this important area of work-life balance?
Minister to reply.
Chris to do it.
Reply.
So, Mr. President, I think that it's fair to say that these. I don't think it's a hope. I mean, I'm aware that this issue has already been raised in this honourable court, and indeed, I think by implication, it's effectively in the programme for government, and it's certainly something that I'm very happy to discuss with the Council of Ministers in terms of, facilities around the summer holidays in particular, which is the main issue that a lot of parents face, and whether we are providing and facilitating enough in the way of opportunities. I mean, certainly, it's part of the material issue. There's two material issues, it seems to me. First of all, the sort of issue of hunger, and to make sure that is being appropriately looked at, and to make sure that children in particular are being properly fed, and of course the availability of facilities during those holidays and the cost of such facilities. But certainly I know that there is a lot of provision, for example, at the NSC during school holidays, lots of programmes, always a well laid out programme. I congratulate the relevant department for that. What we've got to make sure is that some of those are perhaps spread a little bit more across the island, so that parents in the outlying regions can also access these types of opportunities relatively easily. So I'm very happy to commit to picking up this conversation within the Council of Ministers and to, in due course, feeding back as to what type of progress has been made. But also, I do want to emphasise this, Mr. President, because there is also an onus, we're not the nanny state, there is also an onus on society, to ensure that that individuals who are in these circumstances are pulling their weight. And parents have been pulling their weight for years to make sure that in the school holidays children are facilitated and looked after. And a lot of those parents are on low incomes, may not necessarily be in the EPA system, but are having to work both using family support and the opportunities available being made available by relevant agencies on the ground.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And just to sort of build on the points that have been made, and that I accept a lot of what the Treasury Minister has said and look forward to his presentation. I think there's a danger here of looking at this through our own personal experiences. And I suppose the question I want to put to the Treasury Minister is that does he accept that not all 13-year-olds are the same, and that there's likely to be a gap between those who will be able to claim for medium and higher level disability living allowance on the one hand, and yet there's still a big gap between those and others who perhaps parents wouldn't be comfortable leaving them to their own devices at home, whether that's at term time or in the school holidays. Just to pick up one element of the complexity of this, but I'm happy to leave it to the but that's the question I think I want to pose to the Minister at this point.
Well, Mr. President, I think that the Honourable Speaker then is sort of referring to disability allowance and special circumstances, and I think that if you'd have a look at what the proposals are, we were not seeking to materially impact those parents who, or lone parents particularly, who had those sorts of scenarios. In fact, my view was that there was no change at all for lone parents with disabled children in terms of the hours that they had to work for.
I'm sorry, Mr. President, I think that I may have rambled so as to make the question incoherent. The question was that there's a big, does the Minister accept there's a big gap between those who are on the medium level of disability but who may still not be, it might not be appropriate to leave them to their own devices in their own home. Not all 13-year-olds have that capability, that independence, that resourcefulness to be able to look after themselves in that circumstance, but may still not be eligible for medium or high-level DLA.
Reply, sir.
All right. My recollection, Mr. President, in those circumstances there was no change to the current requirements for parents who are claiming mid or upper level disability living allowance.